The morning sun was shining brightly over the city as people hurried through the glass doors of the Grand Convention Center. It was a big day, the start of the annual Global Business Summit, where CEOs, investors, and top professionals gathered from all around the country. Expensive cars pulled up one after another, and photographers clicked their cameras as powerful names in business walked down the red carpet entrance. Everyone wanted to be noticed. Among the crowd was Mr. Jordan Miles, a man in his early 40s, tall, confident, and calm. He wasn't just any businessman. He was the founder and CEO of Miles Dynamics, a rapidly growing tech company known for innovation and community work. Jordan had started his journey from almost nothing. Years ago, he had worked night shifts while studying business administration during the day. He faced countless rejections, but his determination and focus had made him one of the most respected Black CEOs in the country. That morning, Jordan arrived in a black luxury sedan. His driver opened the door, and Jordan stepped out, adjusting his navy blue suit. He carried himself with quiet confidence, greeting a few familiar faces with a polite smile. He didn't need to show off. His presence alone commanded respect. He had been invited to this event not only as a VIP guest, but also as a keynote speaker who would later address hundreds of business leaders about leadership and equality in modern workplaces. Inside the hall, everything looked stunning. Golden chandeliers, red velvet curtains, and rows of perfectly arranged seats with VIP tags on them. Waiters moved quickly, offering coffee and pastries to the guests. The sound of laughter and small talk filled the room as executives greeted each other with handshakes and smiles that didn't always reach their eyes. Everyone wanted to look important. Jordan walked through the main doors, his event badge hanging neatly around his neck. The badge clearly said VIP guest speaker. He looked around for his seat, and near the front row, he saw one labeled reserved VIP. He smiled lightly and took his place there. He placed his leather briefcase by his feet, pulled out his phone, and started checking some last-minute notes for his speech. As he sat there quietly, a few people nearby glanced at him. Some nodded politely, while others seemed unsure of who he was. In high-end events like this, appearances often shaped first impressions, and unfortunately, not always in fair ways. But Jordan was used to that. He had faced these subtle judgments all his life. People assuming he didn't belong in certain rooms until they learned who he really was. It no longer made him angry. It just reminded him why his work mattered. Minutes passed, and the hall began to fill. A few well-known CEOs walked in, shaking hands and greeting others. Jordan stayed in his seat, calm and focused. He thought about his speech. It was going to be about leadership, respect, and the importance of diversity in modern business culture. He wanted to share how true leadership meant treating everyone with dignity, no matter their position or background. Then, something strange happened. A young event staff member, maybe in her 20s, walked toward him with a slightly nervous smile. She looked down at his badge, then back at him, hesitating. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "This seat might be reserved for another VIP guest." Jordan raised an eyebrow politely. "Oh, I believe this is my seat," he replied gently, showing her the printed card with his name and the event's logo. The staff member frowned slightly, unsure what to do. "I understand, sir, but this section is only for speakers and high-level guests," she said. Her tone was respectful, but carried a hint of assumption, as if she didn't quite believe he was one of them. Jordan stayed calm. He didn't argue or raise his voice. "I am one of the keynote speakers," he said with a smile, showing her his badge again. But she still seemed uncertain. She looked around, as if seeking someone's approval, before asking him to wait a moment. A few nearby attendees began to glance over, curious about the small exchange. Whispers started to spread. Nothing loud, just quiet murmurs. Jordan could feel the familiar sting of being doubted. but he kept his posture straight and his expression calm. After a moment, another staff member, perhaps her supervisor, came over. This one was firmer, holding a clipboard. "Sir, I'm sorry," he said, "but we need you to move to another seat in the back until we confirm your registration. These front seats are for confirmed VIPs." Jordan took a slow breath. The words hit him harder than he let show. He had been in this industry for over 15 years. He had built a company worth millions. And yet, here he was, being told to move because someone didn't think he belonged in the VIP section, but he didn't make a scene. He simply nodded, gathered his things, and stood up quietly. As he walked toward the back, a few people watched him, some with confusion, others with silent judgment. In that moment, Jordan's mind was calm, but his heart was heavy. He didn't care about the seat, he cared about what it represented. Even after achieving so much, he still had to prove himself. But deep inside, he knew one thing. Soon, everyone in that room would know exactly who he was. And when that moment came, they wouldn't forget it. As Jordan moved toward the back of the hall, a strange silence seemed to follow him. Some guests whispered softly, pretending not to stare, while others avoided looking altogether. The young staff member who had asked him to move looked uncomfortable, but she said nothing. To her, it was just a small mistake. But to Jordan, it was a moment that carried years of painful memories. He found an empty seat near the back, far from the glowing chandeliers and the fancy VIP nameplates. The air there felt different, quieter, colder. He sat down and placed his briefcase on his lap, keeping his calm expression. But deep inside, his chest tightened. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was just ... disappointed. After everything he had accomplished, this kind of thing still happened. Jordan glanced around. The VIP seats up front were now being filled by people dressed in luxury brands, gold watches, designer shoes, and confident smiles. One man sitting in the same row where Jordan had been looked back at him with a smug smirk, as if to say, "You didn't belong there anyway." Jordan simply gave a faint smile in return. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. The host's voice echoed from the stage, cheerful and energetic. "Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Global Business Summit 2025. The crowd clapped, and the room buzzed with energy again. Jordan clapped politely, still in his corner, while the host went on to thank the sponsors and partners who made the event possible. Ironically, Jordan's own company, Miles Dynamics, was one of those main sponsors. His company's logo even appeared on the giant LED screen behind the stage. Yet no one seemed to connect the dots. A few rows ahead, a woman in a gray suit whispered to her colleague, "Isn't that Jordan Miles, the tech CEO? Why is he sitting back there?" Her friend shrugged. Maybe he came late or didn't get a proper seat. They didn't know what had actually happened, and for now, Jordan didn't feel like explaining. Meanwhile, the staff continued moving around, greeting VIPs and checking lists. The same supervisor who had asked Jordan to move earlier walked by again, still unaware of his mistake. He greeted another executive warmly, shaking hands and offering bottled water. While completely ignoring Jordan, Jordan leaned back in his chair and looked around the grand hall. The shining lights, the polite laughter, the people pretending to be important. It reminded him of why he had started his company in the first place, to build spaces where people were seen for their talent, not their skin color or background. He could still remember his first investor meeting years ago, when someone had once told him, "You don't look like a CEO." He had laughed it off then, but the words had burned in his memory ever since. And now, sitting in the back of a room that his own money had helped sponsor, he felt that same burn again. Just then, one of the event managers walked up to the microphone to make an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have with us some of the most influential leaders in business today. Please give a round of applause to our VIP guests." One by one, the announcer began calling out names. The people Jordan had seen in the front row stood up proudly as their names were mentioned, waving at the crowd. Jordan listened quietly. Then, just as the applause began to fade, he heard the words that made his heart stop. And finally, the announcer said with a bright smile, "We are especially proud to welcome our keynote speaker and platinum sponsor, the founder and CEO of Miles Dynamics, Mr. Jordan Miles." The spotlight turned toward the crowd, scanning for him, but he wasn't in the VIP section where everyone expected him to be. The guests looked around, confused. The host blinked, waiting for him to stand. Heads turned. Whispers filled the air. Then, slowly, Jordan rose from his seat at the back. For a brief second, the entire room froze. The same staff who had asked him to move earlier went pale, realizing what had just happened. The supervisor's face turned red. He looked down at his clipboard, speechless. Jordan began walking down the aisle. Each step echoed softly on the marble floor. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry. He walked with quiet dignity, calm, steady, and completely in control. The crowd parted slightly as he passed, eyes wide, some people even standing to clap out of respect or embarrassment. When he finally reached the stage, he shook the announcer's hand and smiled. "Thank you," he said into the microphone, his deep voice calm but powerful. "It's an honor to be here." He paused for a moment and looked toward the front row, the same row where he had been asked to move from not long ago. The staff avoided his eyes. The audience could feel the tension in the air, though no one spoke a word. Jordan didn't mention what had happened. Not yet. He simply began his opening remarks about leadership, respect, and equality in the business world. But behind his composed expression, he already knew something. This moment wasn't over. He wasn't the type to seek revenge, but he was the type to teach a lesson. And before the day was over, everyone in that room, from the highest executive to the newest event assistant, would learn exactly what true leadership looked like. Asterisk, the audience was still clapping as Jordan stood on stage, the spotlight glowing softly on his calm, steady face. The atmosphere was polite, but beneath that politeness, there was confusion, even tension. People were whispering, wondering how the man they had just seen sitting quietly at the back had suddenly become the star of the show. The staff who had embarrassed him moments earlier looked as if the ground might open up beneath their feet. Jordan smiled gently, adjusting the microphone. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice smooth but commanding. "It's an honor to stand before such brilliant minds today." His tone was warm, yet there was something powerful in it, a quiet authority that made everyone listen closely. He glanced toward the front row, the same row from which he had been asked to move. For a brief second, his eyes met the supervisor's, who immediately looked down, his hands fidgeting nervously with the clipboard. Jordan continued, speaking about leadership, innovation, and purpose. But behind every sentence, there was a hidden message, a message about respect. "In business," he said, "titles may open doors, but character decides how long those doors stay open." Some people nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They knew exactly what had just happened before this speech, and they knew he knew too as he spoke. A few screens around the hall displayed his name and photo, along with details about his company, Miles Dynamics, empowering change through innovation. The crowd murmured softly as the numbers flashed on the big screen: $850 million in valuation, 3,000 employees worldwide, and partnerships with global firms. Slowly, the whispers turned into disbelief. "That's him?" Someone in the audience whispered. "I thought he was just another guest," said another. "Didn't they ask him to move earlier?" A third voice added, eyes wide. The truth was spreading quickly across the room like fire in dry grass. The very people who had silently judged him were now realizing they had underestimated a man of great power and influence. Jordan noticed the shifting energy in the crowd, but didn't pause. Instead, he leaned slightly forward and said, "Leadership isn't about standing above others. It's about standing with them. It's about respect, even when no one is watching." Those words landed like thunder. The room grew silent. Every staff member who had played a part in his humiliation now looked frozen, unable to meet his gaze. The young woman who had first asked him to move looked close to tears. She had never meant harm. She had just followed instructions. But the weight of her actions hit her hard now. Jordan, however, didn't raise his voice or show anger. He continued to speak about humility, kindness, and equality, the very values missing in the treatment he had just received. His calmness only made his message stronger. Halfway through the speech, a large digital banner appeared behind him, listing the event's sponsors. At the top of the list, in bold letters, was Platinum Sponsor. Miles Dyon Myces gasps filled the room. Some of the front row executives turned to each other, whispering in shock. One man muttered, "He's the main sponsor." His voice carried enough that people nearby heard him. The realization struck deeper. Not only was Jordan an honored guest, he had funded the very event they were sitting in. Jordan paused, smiled slightly, and said, "Sometimes life gives us moments that test our patience, moments where people don't see who we truly are. But every moment is an opportunity to reveal character, theirs and ours." The crowd stayed silent. His words weren't just about business anymore. They were personal, real, and heavy with meaning. He finished his speech to a standing ovation. The applause was loud, partly out of respect, partly out of guilt. Even those who had ignored or doubted him earlier clapped the hardest, trying to make up for their mistake. Jordan nodded humbly and stepped off the stage. As he walked down, the same supervisor who had once told him to move from the VIP seat rushed forward, his face pale. "Mr. Miles, I am so sorry, sir," he stammered. "We didn't realize." Jordan stopped him with a calm smile. "It's okay," he said softly. "You didn't need to realize who I was. You just needed to treat everyone with the same respect." Those words hit harder than any anger could. The supervisor looked down, unable to speak. Jordan walked back toward the VIP area, and this time, no one stopped him. People stood aside as he passed, their eyes following him with admiration and shame. He sat in his original seat, the same one he had been removed from earlier. Only now, it felt symbolic. It wasn't just a seat anymore. It was a throne reclaimed with dignity, not pride. A few minutes later, the event director hurried over, apologizing profusely and thanking him for his powerful speech. Jordan accepted the apology gracefully, but remained composed. Inside, he wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about the lesson this moment carried, not just for those who had disrespected him, but for everyone watching. Because leadership isn't proven when things go right. It's revealed when things go wrong, and how you respond defines everything. As the session ended, reporters and attendees rushed to speak with him. Cameras flashed, journalists asked questions, and social media began buzzing with clips and quotes from his speech. What no one knew yet was that this wasn't the end of the story. Jordan had stayed calm for now, but he had already made a quiet decision in his mind before the day ended. Justice would be served. Not through anger. Not through revenge. But through leadership, the kind that changes how people think forever. Asterisk after his powerful speech. The air inside the hall felt heavy, almost electric. The applause had ended, but the silence that followed said even more. People avoided eye contact, pretending to check their phones or sip coffee, unsure of how to act after what had just unfolded. Jordan walked calmly back to his seat, but his mind was anything but calm. He had made his point with dignity. Yet something inside him whispered that the lesson wasn't complete. As the next session began, the event staff moved around nervously. The young woman who had asked him to move earlier was trembling, her hands shaking as she held a tray of bottled water. Every time her eyes met Jordan's, she quickly looked away, guilt painted all over her face. The supervisor, however, stood near the corner, stiff and pale. He knew the mistake was his and that the situation was about to get worse. Jordan sat quietly, his hands folded. To everyone else, he looked relaxed, but inside, he was reflecting deeply. All his life, he had been patient. He had dealt with ignorance, disrespect, and prejudice in silence. But today wasn't just another moment of silent endurance. It was a public humiliation. In a place where professionalism and equality were supposed to shine. And that made it different. When the host returned to the stage to announce a short break, people began to rise from their seats. Jordan stood as well. This was his moment. Calmly, he turned and walked toward the event staff standing near the entrance. Every eye seemed to follow him. "Excuse me," Jordan said politely, addressing the supervisor. "Can we have a quick word?" The man's face drained of color. "Of course, sir." Mr. Miles' Jordan gestured for him to follow. They moved a few steps aside, near a group of organizers and camera crew who had been watching curiously. Then, in a firm but measured tone, Jordan spoke. "When I arrived this morning, I was told to leave my assigned seat," he began. "I was asked to move because someone assumed I didn't belong there. I didn't argue because I believe in staying calm. But now that everyone knows who I am, I want to make one thing very clear." The man swallowed hard, eyes flickering toward the crowd that was slowly gathering to watch. Jordan continued, his voice calm but sharp as glass. "This isn't about a seat. It's about respect. If I were not the CEO of a major company, if I were just another guest, I would have been treated the same way, wouldn't I?" The supervisor opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The young staff member who had earlier asked Jordan to move stood nearby, tears welling up in her eyes. Jordan turned to the rest of the staff. "You all represent this event. The way you treat people reflects the values of your organization. And today, those values were nowhere to be found." The murmurs grew louder. Attendees from across the hall started pulling out their phones, recording quietly. The entire room could feel the weight of the moment. A man who had been silently humiliated was now reclaiming his dignity with grace and truth. Jordan looked at the event director, who had just hurried over. "Tell me," he asked, "is this the kind of behavior your company supports?" The director shook his head quickly. "Absolutely not, Mr. Miles. This is a terrible misunderstanding. I deeply apologize on behalf of everyone." Jordan nodded slightly. "Apology accepted," he said calmly. "But an apology doesn't erase the example that was set here. Every leader in this room saw how your team treated someone they didn't recognize. That's not professionalism, that's prejudice." The director's face turned red. "You're absolutely right, sir. I assure you, we will take immediate action." Jordan paused, looking straight into his eyes. "No," he said slowly, "I'll take the action." The room froze. The sound of conversations faded away until only silence remained. Everyone's eyes were fixed on him. He turned slightly toward the audience, who were now openly watching the exchange. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "I want to make something very clear. Respect in business isn't negotiable. Today's incident wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of how easily people can judge without understanding." Then, with calm authority, he turned to the director and said, "This entire event crew is officially terminated, effective immediately. I'll be bringing in my company's own management team to take over event operations for the remainder of the summit." Gasps filled the air. The staff stood frozen, disbelief written across their faces. Cameras were rolling, recording every second. The young woman who had first spoken to him began crying quietly, but Jordan didn't raise his voice or gloat. He simply added, "I don't fire people out of anger. I do it to protect standards. When you lead with fairness, not fear, not assumptions." The director tried to speak, but Jordan held up his hand. "This is not revenge," he said softly. "It's responsibility." With that, he turned and walked back toward the stage, leaving behind stunned silence and the echo of his footsteps. The audience erupted into quiet applause, not loud, but respectful. The moment had transformed from humiliation to history. As Jordan left the hall, several guests followed him, shaking his hand and praising his composure. One older executive said, "That was the most powerful lesson I've ever seen in leadership." Jordan smiled faintly. "Sometimes," he replied, "leadership isn't about giving a speech. It's about standing up when it counts." Outside, as the cameras flashed and reporters rushed to capture the story, Jordan didn't look back. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered to every person who had doubted, judged, or underestimated him. The man they had tried to push aside had just stood taller than ever before. And that day, in that hall, respect had finally taken the VIP seat it always deserved. He next morning. The sun rose over the city like nothing had happened, but inside the business world, a storm was already brewing. Overnight, a short video clip from the conference had exploded across the internet. It showed the moment Jordan Miles calmly announced the termination of the entire event crew in front of hundreds of people. Within hours, the clip had millions of views. Comments flooded every platform, some shocked, others inspired. Hashtags like #BlackCEO, #Leadership with Dignity, and #Respect in Business trended across social media. Everyone wanted to know who this man was, what really happened, and why his reaction was so powerful. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines read, "CEO humiliated at Business Summit, then turns the tables with grace." Jordan Miles teaches the world a lesson in leadership. From VIP seat to viral symbol of respect, the story of Miles' dynamics. CEO as journalists scrambled for interviews. People across industries began to talk. Some called him ruthless, but most called him brilliant. A man who didn't just talk about equality, but lived it. Even those who didn't know his company were suddenly searching for it online. Miles Dynamics website traffic skyrocketed overnight. In his office, Jordan watched the news unfold quietly. He wasn't smiling or celebrating. He just sat behind his desk, looking out the window at the city skyline, deep in thought. For him, it had never been about fame or attention. It was about Principal, his assistant. Maya walked in holding a tablet. "Sir, your story's everywhere," she said softly. CNN, Forbes, Business Weekly, everyone's covering it. The board is getting calls from investors, and people are saying you've inspired them. Jordan leaned back in his chair. "Good," he said. "Let them be inspired, not by what I did, but by why I did it." Maya nodded. The event company's management just released a public apology. They've admitted to mishandling the situation. They said they're launching an internal investigation. Jordan didn't respond right away. He knew an apology was necessary, but real change needed more than just words. After a long pause, he finally said, "We'll see if they mean it." Meanwhile, outside his office, the world continued to react. Influencers and business leaders began sharing their opinions. Some admired how he kept his calm instead of exploding in anger. Others praised his discipline and clarity, how he handled disrespect with logic. Not ego. One comment on social media summed it up perfectly. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just acted. That's what real power looks like. Within days, universities invited Jordan to speak to their students. Leadership forums requested his presence. Young entrepreneurs saw him as a role model. Even people who had never experienced discrimination found strength in his story, because at its heart, it wasn't just about race or power. It was about self-respect. But while the world saw him as a hero, Jordan remained humble. When asked in an interview about the incident, he said, "Respect shouldn't depend on a name tag. You shouldn't need power to be treated as human." His words spread just as fast as the video itself. At the same time, the fired event staff members faced their own turning point. Some felt shame and regret. The young woman who had first asked him to move wrote a public letter online, apologizing directly to him. In it, she said, "I didn't realize I was judging someone by appearance. I learned that respect isn't about titles, it's about humanity. Mr. Miles taught me that without saying a single harsh word." Jordan read the letter days later. Instead of feeling anger, he felt compassion. He knew that people learned best through experience, not punishment. So he made another bold move. He reached out privately to the young woman, offering her a job interview at Miles Dynamics. His reason was simple. People deserve a second chance when they learn their first lesson well. When that news broke, it only made the world admire him more. People called him not just a leader, but a teacher, a man who could stand firm without losing his humanity. As the days passed, the story transformed from scandal to symbol. It wasn't just about one man or one moment anymore. It was about a message. Companies started holding discussions about workplace respect and equality. Some even created new training programs using Jordan's story as an example. And through it all, Jordan kept working silently, building his company, mentoring young leaders, and proving that greatness doesn't come from power. It comes from how you use it. What had started as a public humiliation had become something far greater, a movement, a lesson, a turning point for everyone who had ever been told, "You don't belong here." Because now, thanks to Jordan Miles, the world understood one simple truth. Belonging isn't something you're given. It's something you earn and protect with dignity. Weeks passed, but the echo of that moment when Jordan Miles stood calmly on stage and fired the entire crew didn't fade away. It grew louder. It turned from a trending story into a global discussion. Across social media, people were still talking about it. Some shared the clip again and again, calling it the moment that redefined leadership. Others used his name as a symbol of standing up without shouting, of staying dignified even when disrespected. Business schools began using his story in lectures. Professors played the video in classrooms and asked students, "What would you have done in his place?" Many answered honestly, they would have lost their temper. But that was the difference. Jordan hadn't. His silence, his calmness, his control, that's what people admired most. Soon, top newspapers featured him on their covers. One headline read, "The man who taught the world what respect really means." Another said, "From humiliation to history, how one CEO changed the conversation." But while the world praised him, Jordan stayed humble. He didn't host interviews or write long posts online. He simply kept doing what he'd always done, running his company, mentoring young leaders, and pushing for fairness inside every workplace he influenced inside Miles Dynamics. His employees felt even prouder to work for him. They often said, "He's not just our CEO, he's our example." Under his guidance, the company introduced a new policy called Equal Eyes. It trained employees and managers to look at everyone with fairness, to see skill before status, and humanity before hierarchy. The program quickly gained attention. Other companies began adopting it too. Within a few months, over 200 organizations across the country implemented similar training inspired by Jordan's story. It was no longer just about one event. It was becoming a quiet revolution, one based on respect. Meanwhile, Jordan began receiving letters and emails from people around the world. A waitress from Texas wrote, "I watched your video and cried. Last week, I was treated badly by a customer and I almost quit. But after seeing how you handled disrespect, I stood my ground calmly. Thank you for reminding me that my worth isn't defined by how others treat me." A college student from South Africa wrote, "Your story showed me that being black, being different, doesn't make me lesser. It makes me stronger. Thank you for being proof." Jordan read every message. Sometimes late at night, after meetings and flights, he'd sit by his office window and scroll through them. Each one touched him deeply. He realized that the story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible. Still, not everyone was supportive. A few critics claimed his decision to fire the crew was too harsh. They said he should have handled it privately. But even those critics admitted that his calm composure and later offer to rehire the young woman showed his true character. He wasn't cruel. He was firm and fair. One day, during a leadership summit months later, Jordan was invited as the chief guest. When he walked into the hall, people stood up in applause. He didn't see arrogance in their eyes this time. He saw respect. Real, earned respect as he took the stage. He looked around at the sea of faces and said, "You know, the world remembers what we do in our calmest moments, not our loudest. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands still and speaks through silence." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. People nodded. Some even wiped tears after the event. An older man approached him, a retired CEO who had once doubted Jordan's leadership. He shook his hand firmly and said, "Son, I've led companies for 40 years. But you've done something I never managed to do. You changed behavior with grace." Jordan smiled softly. "Thank you," he replied. "But I didn't change behavior. I just reminded people of something they already knew, but forgot. Respect is free, and it should never be withheld." That night, when Jordan returned home, he sat alone in his living room, the city lights glowing through the window. He thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the speech, the confrontation, and now, the movement it had started. He realized something profound. Sometimes life gives you pain not to break you, but to place you exactly where your purpose can shine. The escalated, the incident that had begun as an act of disrespect, had become the very reason thousands of people learned the meaning of dignity, equality, and strength. And though he never said it out loud, Jordan understood one quiet truth. He hadn't just fired a crew that day. He had fired a mindset. The kind of mindset that judged people by appearance instead of ability. The kind that whispered, "You don't belong," to those who did. Now, that mindset was being replaced by something far greater: respect. Asterisk months turned into a year. But the story of Jordan Miles never faded. It grew stronger with time. What began as a quiet act of courage in one crowded conference hall had transformed into a movement that reshaped how people thought about respect, leadership, and equality. By now, Jordan had become more than a name. He had become a symbol. Universities taught his story in ethics and management classes. Corporations quoted his words in meetings. Even ordinary people, teachers, nurses, students, and workers, found strength in the calm power he showed that day. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some thanked him for inspiring them. Others shared their own stories of standing tall against disrespect. Jordan always listened patiently. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a reminder. A reminder that dignity is not given. It is carried in his office. The walls were filled with photos from the past year, not awards or trophies, but letters and thank you notes from strangers. One written by a janitor from New York said, "I watched your story, sir. It made me hold my head high again. When someone looked down on me, I remembered how you stood on that stage, calm, proud, and unshaken. I may not be a CEO, but I'm proud of who I am. Jordan read that letter often. It reminded him why he did what he did. Meanwhile, his company, Miles Dynamics, had grown beyond expectations. Investors trusted him more than ever. The equalize policy he started had been adopted by hundreds of companies around the world. It wasn't just a program anymore. It was a philosophy. The phrase, "see the person before the position," had become the company's new motto, printed on every employee badge. But Jordan didn't stop there. He started a foundation, the Miles Initiative, to help young entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. The goal was simple: to give opportunities to those who are often overlooked. Talent, he once said in a speech, is everywhere. Opportunity isn't. That's what I want to change. And he did. Within a few years, dozens of small businesses grew under his mentorship. Many of those young leaders said that watching Jordan's calm, fearless reaction at that summit had given them the courage to start their journeys. But beyond success, Jordan's true legacy wasn't written in numbers or headlines. It was written in hearts. He had changed the way people saw each other. His story became proof that you could be powerful without being cruel, that you could demand respect without shouting, and that silence could roar louder than anger ever could. One afternoon, while attending a university seminar as a guest speaker, a student stood up and asked him, "Sir, if that day never happened, if no one had asked you to move from your seat, do you think your message would have reached this far?" Jordan smiled gently. "Maybe not," he said. "Sometimes the worst moments in life are the doors to our greatest purpose." That day taught me something. You don't need to wait for respect. You can create it. Not by fighting, but by showing who you are. The hall erupted in applause. Some students had tears in their eyes. Later that evening, as the sun set and the city lights came alive, Jordan walked along the balcony of his office building. The skyline shimmered with golden reflections, and a soft wind brushed against his face. He thought about the past, the humiliation, the silence, the calm defiance, and the storm that followed. He realized something profound. Leadership isn't about control, it's about character. The real test isn't how you act when people cheer for you, but how you behave when they doubt you. Down below, through the glass windows of a nearby building, he noticed a janitor mopping the floor. The man caught Jordan's eye and smiled, raising a small wave. Jordan smiled back and nodded respectfully. That simple exchange, quiet, human, and real, felt more meaningful than all the applause he had ever received, because that was what his journey had always been about. Seeing people. Truly seeing them, the world had given Jordan a seat among the powerful. But life had given him something greater, a purpose. To remind people that respect is the foundation of all true success. And so, as the night fell and the city buzzed with life, the legacy of Jordan Miles continued, not through his voice, but through the thousands of voices he had awakened. He had walked into a room one day and been told he didn't belong. But when he walked out, he had changed what belonging meant forever.